Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. You'll want to stick around for today's story if you like romantic fantasy. I feel like a lot of times I need to list a few fun elements in the story to make sure I catch anyone who might like the story. But with romantic fantasy, I feel like people either want all the romantic fantasy or none of it. So that's all the hint you get. Today's story is also part 1 of 2, so you'll want to come back next week to catch the conclusion. It's written by Celeste Baxendell, who endeavors to write devastatingly romantic stories with compelling, complex characters finding light in dark times. Stick around to the end, or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from the author. For now, please enjoy Shoes of Red, Part 1 by Celeste Baxendell. Chapter 1. Karyne held the attention of every single member of the court in the palm of her hand, and everything was right with the world. Her stage was slight in stature, but it was by no means poor. While the Castian's Castle performance room was a converted ballroom, it was simple in its elegance, and all performers in Castia dreamed of being on its stage. She glanced over her shoulder and flashed a brilliant smile at the musicians behind her. The conductor, Kurt, gave her a nod before raising his weathered hands, and the musicians lifted their instruments. The first few haunting notes floated through the air. Karyne let it settle over the crowd before lifting her head and throwing herself into the movement. The music spoke to her, and it was magic. She knew exactly which move to make next, whether it was precisely how high to lift her hand, or whether she needed to land on her left or right foot. She knew which one it had to be. Every move she made was the right one. Others might argue that dance was supposed to be organic and about discovery. Right answers didn't exist. It was about artistic expression. However, were they performing before Castia's court every other night? No. That honor belonged to Karyne alone. The notes increased in speed, and so did Karyne. Her artfully crafted and embroidered red skirts whirled around, twisting and showing off the fluidity of her movements. While her hair was pulled up tightly, a few deep auburn strands fell loose regardless. When she kicked one leg up to her chin, the audience got a peek at her bright red shoes before they disappeared under her equally red skirts. Her breath was even and measured, despite the sweat pouring down her brow as she kept up with the dramatic and tragic song. It had been written especially for her, after all, and after months of entertaining the court, she had more than earned the honor of such a composition. Her feet brushed the ground for a second before she carried herself into the next section, utilizing the full length of stage at her disposal. The court was on 3 sides of the raised thrust stage, and she had to make sure they all got what they wanted. She lifted one leg in the air, spinning on the toes of the other. She moved into a dip, turning to face the royal family in the only balcony seats. The younger prince's mouth opened, and whether he was going to gasp or say something to the other occupants of the box, she didn't know. She moved too quickly, letting the weight of her body pull her down, but catching herself with her hands and pushing herself back up effortlessly. She winked at him before leaping gracefully across the stage, losing herself in the dance completely. Far sooner than she wanted, the music slowed, and Karyne landed in the center of the stage in her final pose. Once the last few notes faded into the air, the audience burst into applause. Karyne couldn't stop the grin twisting onto her face. There was no sound better than raucous applause devoted solely to her. She turned to face the royal family sitting in the balcony and dipped into a sweeping curtsy. Once she and the musicians took their bows and the applause died, the court rose from their seats and talked amongst themselves. Karyne stepped away, heading to the wings backstage just as the royal family came down from the balcony, letting out right in front of her. "Excellent performance, as always," the king said as he led his family out of the stairwell. Karyne dipped into a curtsy as Kurt stepped forward, bowing to show his respect. "I'm glad you think so, Your Majesty," Karyne said, lifting her head. "You really have pulled out all the stops for us, Your Majesty," a new voice said. Karyne hadn't noticed him earlier when he was hidden in the dim candlelight, but in all the brightened lamps, she saw him much better. He was a striking young man, obviously foreign from the husky accent in his voice. Money was clearly no object for him, considering he was just as richly dressed as the princes he stood beside. "Karyne is our favorite performer. We could hardly host you two without showing you the best Castia has to offer," the king said. Karen's eyes flickered past the foreign young man to his companion. She was a young woman who was close in age to the man, dressed well, but not quite as well. She was pretty, but Karyne was gratified to see the woman was not nearly as beautiful as Karyne herself was. But to be fair, the woman didn't have Karen's perfect auburn hair. Hers was a dark brown, so taking that into consideration, she wasn't worse than average. "Yes, I believe we can all agree on that," the man said. His eyes roamed over Karyne, starting at her head and landing on her feet. The edge of her shoes peeked out under her red and gold skirts. She suppressed the urge to shiver and made a note to stay away from him. Hopefully, whoever they were, they wouldn't be in Castia long. Someone had probably mentioned who they were, but she likely forgot about it. Foreign politics went over her head, and as long as it didn't endanger her position, she didn't care. The king waved his hand, dismissing Karyne and the musicians. The court was filtering out of the room as the musicians packed up. Karyne stopped to speak with Kurt on her way out about their next rehearsal and the arrangements. They were just about finished when she spotted two prince-sized inconveniences approaching. Prince Lucian and Prince Florian were the only children of the king and queen, similar in good looks, but complete opposites in hair color and temperament. Karyne had absolutely no interest in either of them. She'd heard some of the girls of the court wistfully sigh after their bright eyes and strong classical features, which was perfectly fine for noble women. But Karyne was not so privileged or doe-eyed. Kurt bowed and Karyne curtsied. They both murmured, "Your Highnesses." "I'm so glad to have caught you," Prince Lucian said, taking the older conductor by the arm. "I wanted to put in a few quick suggestions for your selections this week." Prince Lucian swept him away, and Karyne knew she wasn't going to get Kurt back. Everyone in the palace knew the crown prince's suggestions were never just suggestions, and they were never quick. She glanced at Prince Florian, who hovered in front of her, staring at the ground. Her feet ached, and she wanted nothing more than to kick off her shoes and get into a warm bath. Was there a polite way to leave? Or should she go for it and hope Prince Florian's quiet demeanor kept him from viewing her departure as disrespectful? She turned around and started to head for her exit when he cleared his throat softly. And she knew there was no leaving without a few niceties. Karyne faced him and lifted her skirts as she curtsied again. She kept her voice light as she said, "Yes, Your Highness?" Florian brushed his hands against his trousers before clasping them behind him. "I wanted to say you really outdid yourself tonight. I don't think I've ever seen anyone quite so, uh, graceful. Was he always so ineloquent? Thank you, Karen said, putting on her kindest smile. Well, kind might have been too generous a word. It was as kind as Karen was capable of when her post performance exhaustion set in. I endeavor to astound the court with each and every performance. You certainly succeeded. Florian's blue eyes lit up. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. Her smile tightened. I, uh, I don't know if you were told. It was all a little last minute, but, um, there's going to be a small ball tomorrow night for the court and our special guests. Florian glanced at her before flicking his eyes away. She waited for him to continue, but as the seconds ticked by, he stayed silent. Was he after something specific? She cleared her throat. Well, it's a little short notice, but I'm sure Kurt and I can find an arrangement and get a short performance together. No. Florian looked up. His knuckles turned white at his side. No, you don't have to perform. If you want to come, that is. I wanted to, um, I wanted to make sure you knew you were invited. I would be happy to attend, Karen said. There was no polite way to turn down a personal invitation from royalty, even if the royal in question couldn't string two coherent sentences together. Florian lit up again, and Karen was starting to get whiplash. He backed away, inclining his head. I hope to see you there. Karen dipped into a curtsy, and as soon as he was far enough away, she turned on her heel and headed backstage to finish her post-performance tasks before heading to her quarters. In the few months she'd been at the palace, she'd started to figure out the dynamics of court and the royal family. The one thing that she didn't understand was just how Prince Florian turned out to be a tongue-tied mess when he had the best education in the kingdom and was known for being intelligent. It was probably for the best Prince Lucian was first in line for the throne. As big as the castle was, Karen had managed to get a room in the wing closest to the ballrooms and small theater, which her aching feet appreciated. She swept into her room to see a few handmaids finishing up their chores. With a wave of her hand, she dismissed them. Once they were out, she locked the door and kicked her shoes off. The slight hum under her skin faded. She scooped her red shoes up and pulled out a small locked chest from under her bed. She unlocked it with a key she kept around her neck and tucked her shoes away for safekeeping. So far, no one had tried to steal them, but she didn't want to risk it, not with an object of so much importance. Karen climbed into the warm bath the maids had left her, sighing as her muscles relaxed. She didn't have any personal servants, but thanks to her position as a court entertainer, her room was well kept, and she always had a warm bath ready for her after she performed. Buying those shoes was the best decision she'd ever made. It had been a gamble. She had to use all the money she'd had left to her name, but when she saw the opportunity, she wasn't going to pass it up. From bare feet, threadbare skirts, and sleeping on the streets, to an exquisite room in the palace as close to nobility as a poor commoner could be. Who knew all she had to do was put on a pair of red shoes and dance to get there? Well, actually, she did. Chapter 2. Not many people showed, but that didn't surprise Karen. Her mother was an only child, and her father had been as well. If there was any family left to invite, she didn't know about them. Her mother had always kept to herself, so there weren't many family friends that showed. No one she could rely on. A gust of wind blew through the streets, and Karen wrapped her arms around her, wincing at the chill seeping into her bones. The only dress she had appropriate for a funeral was the one her mother wore all those years ago when Karen's father died. The wind cut through the thin fabric, digging in through the many moth-eaten holes. Even if she had something warmer, she'd sold all of it already. Apparently, the wealth of her childhood hadn't lasted nearly as long as her mother had pretended it had. When her mother fell ill and Karen insisted on fetching the best physician in the capital, she discovered just how little was actually in their coffers. It wasn't enough for any decent medicine, or to pay off the debts left behind when her mother did pass. The tears hadn't stopped by the time she found out she was losing the house, her house, in order to cover the debts her mother left behind. The money lenders told her she had until the funeral to collect her things and leave. So Karen walked down the street with her bag over her shoulder. Her bare feet brushed the cobblestone. She'd sold all of her expensive clothes first, and when that hadn't gotten her far, she'd sold everything else down to the shoes on her feet. The only thing she refused to part with were the books. Reading had been her mother's favorite activity since her health didn't permit her to engage in anything strenuous. Karen would rather starve than sell those books. There were too many memories. She only hoped that as she wasted away on the streets, the memories of her mother reading poems to her as a child would comfort her. The coins in her pocket clinked, and she had no idea what to do with them. The money lenders took her home from her, so she made sure to hide all the money she had left. They weren't getting any more from her, but selling her belongings only gave her so much coin. She didn't know what to do with it. If she was going to survive, she had to be smart about spending it. She needed a place to live and a way to keep earning a living. But how? She had a few skills, but nothing practical. She could read, her calligraphy was spotless, but what good did that do her? With no answer, she kept walking. Eventually, she found herself in the main square downtown. All the market stalls were out. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She couldn't waste her money on food. She needed a long-term solution. An ornate carriage rolled to a stop at the market entrance, causing the crowd to quiet for an instant before whispering to each other. Karen pushed herself onto her toes. The royal crest? The door opened and the crown prince stepped out, brushing his jacket off and flashing a grin and waving at the crowd before turning back and offering his hand. A well-dressed noblewoman took it and stepped down. Her dress was exquisite, with all the right shades of blue to complement her skin. She heard whispers through the crowd. Lady Bianca. Karen's stomach turned, and whether it was from hunger or envy, she wasn't sure. All she wanted was a dress that didn't have holes in it. Some people had all the luck in the world. If Karen had been born noble, she never would have had to worry about her mother squandering their resources. They would have had family, or allies at least, willing to take her in. Someone else climbed out after the lady, but Karen was too busy imagining the smooth feeling of silk on her skin to notice. Guards escorted the trio around the square, making sure no one got too close as they shopped. The crowd whispered and everyone stared, forgetting the business that had brought them there. Lady Bianca threw them a bright smile and waved at a little girl who looked up at her like she was a princess. From the way Crown Prince Lucian looked at her, that seemed to be a distinct possibility. As Karen moved through the crowd, she wondered how well the servants in the palace were taken care of. They had to be housed and fed at the very least. A much less glamorous life than Karen would prefer, but with hunger gnawing at her stomach, what choice was there? Such a shame. I understand, I do. But what will we do without her? Lady Bianca said as they came to a stop near Karyne. They didn't notice her, but no one ever did. Prince Lucian hummed his agreement. Our nights will be quite boring, but it is natural. I don't disagree. I certainly wouldn't want to stand on stage and sing every other night if I was about to give birth. But I do wish it wasn't permanent. Lady Bianca ran her fingers over a fine silk scarf. They were talking about court entertainment. How nice would it be for her biggest worry to be about who was going to be entertaining her? I imagine we'll find someone to replace her soon. Besides, I think we were all getting a little weary of the same songs over and over again. Poor Florian nodded off one too many times to ever be on her good side. Prince Lucian laughed. She has such a wicked glare. The younger prince only shrugged and gave a weak smile. His light reddish blonde hair glinted in the sunlight, a stark contrast to his brother's dark hair and Lady Bianca's black hair. I suppose you have a point. Lady Bianca sighed. Still, I'll miss her input regarding the latest fashions. She was invaluable for stocking my wardrobe. Huh. Karyne hadn't realized how much the court loved entertainers. And if the royal family sponsored them, that paycheck certainly wasn't minuscule. Not if their current favorite was keeping up with Lady Bianca's extravagant tastes. As the royal entourage continued on, Karyne stayed put on the edge of the market. Unfortunately, calligraphy wasn't exactly entertaining, and she couldn't sing to save her life. Still, if there was a way to get in, maybe talent wasn't too far out of her reach. There were rumors of objects that could assist people, magic objects, if one knew what to look for. She'd never had a need for them before, but things had changed. Her fingers went to her pocket, running over the cool coins. The market continued on, and Karyne examined each stall carefully. It wasn't until the sun went down that someone caught her eye. It was a stall with a variety of bright red objects that didn't seem to have anything in common. She'd been to the market 1,000 times before. This wasn't a stall that appeared every day. One of the items out was a pair of bright red shoes. It had taken all her money, but the rush under her skin when she put them on was unlike anything she ever experienced. The next day, when she crawled out of the alley she slept in, musicians were playing in the square, and that was the first time she danced. The rest was history. It was a nice change of pace to enter a ballroom and not be expected to take center stage. Every ball she'd been invited to, she'd been more entertainment than guest. A night off. How novel. Karyne picked out her best dress, red, of course, but a deeper shade rather than the bright eye-catching hue she wore when performing. The burgundy gown had been one of her first purchases when she received her first week of pay. Few things were better than the feeling of silk on her skin. They were in one of the smaller ballrooms, but it was still full thanks to the volume of the court. Karyne wove her way through the room, stopping every so often to speak with a few of the noblewomen. She didn't particularly like them. Even with her own elevated status and fine things, her stomach turned, knowing theirs would always be better just by the accident of birth. It was a challenge burying those feelings, but she needed to stay in everyone's good graces. She laughed at their jokes, agreed with their assessments of the attractiveness of the crown prince and various noblemen, but was careful not to be too enthusiastic, lest they think she was a threat to any of them. She wasn't going to be so silly as to risk everything she'd accomplished by going doe-eyed over someone so far out of her league. As interesting as the idea was, Acquiring a lifetime of security by swindling a nobleman, maybe even a prince, into marrying her, she stood to lose far more. She'd never climb higher than she had already. Getting close to someone meant risking revealing her secrets. If the truth about her ever saw the light of day, her life was over. Her security was in her dancing. Karyne listened to the girls chatter on about various other topics until they all fell silent. She looked up to see Prince Lucian approaching, with a charming grin on his face. They all curtsied as he inclined his head in respect. "Lady Bianca, would you do me the honor of a dance?" Prince Lucian asked. Bianca flashed a bright grin at him before accepting and being whisked away. When it came to Prince Lucian's attention, there was no competing with Lady Bianca. The other girls certainly tried, and they always saw the prince had eyes for no one else. The willowy girl next to Karyne sighed. "I wish this ball hadn't been so last minute." At Karen's confused look, she said, "There would have been time to invite more young men, so the numbers would be even. As it is right now, there are more girls going without partners." Karyne glanced over the room. Almost every young man was out on the floor, the exception being the mysterious foreign guest with harsh eyes and a sharp jaw, who is speaking to Prince Florian. "How come neither of them are dancing?" Karyne asked. "I doubt the scholar's companion, Gothel, I believe is her name, would let him look at another woman," the girl to Karen's left said. "She's been glaring at anyone who so much as breathes in his direction." So that's who that was. The scholar and Gothel. What strange names. Karen's gaze flickered over the beautiful golden ballroom. Gothel hovered near the scholar, unashamedly watching everyone and everything with the gaze of a hawk. Karyne wasn't so quick to believe the woman's harsh, calculating gaze was solely based on a lover's jealousy. There was something smarter in it. Who were they? Why were they in Castia? Just how important and powerful were they? Karyne pushed the questions away. The foreign strangers had nothing to do with her, and only trouble would follow if she continued thinking about it. Whatever it was had to be far above her pay grade. Better to let the royalty worry about it. Still, as Prince Florian stuttered and wrung his hands, Karyne wondered if it was the subject of the conversation, his conversation partner, or the prince's own shy tendencies that caused the air of tension around them. She flickered her gaze around. Was no one going to step in and help him? No one else looked in their direction. Apparently not. Karyne brushed her palms against her skirts, fighting the urge to do it herself. It would be wildly inappropriate for someone of her status to approach the prince. And it's probably for the best Prince Florian doesn't dance. As handsome as he is, last time he danced he left poor Lady Bianca's feet so bruised she holed up in her room for half a week, waiting for them to heal. The willowy girl sighed. Unfortunately, not everyone is as graceful as you, Karyne, the girl on Karen's left said, and Prince Florian's dilemma faded from her mind in the face of such adoration. Stop. You'll make me blush. Karyne grinned at them. Her feeble attempts at waving them off were done all in the hope they might continue with their praise. She craved it like it was water, life-giving. She could never have enough. The more she received, the stronger her craving grew. She always wanted more. The conversation continued on. Eventually, the dance ended, and Prince Lucian returned, asking a different woman to dance. Karyne eased away before he came back again. If he asked, she'd be forced to accept. And if she accepted, the ladies of the court might see her as competition. Instead, she made sure to enjoy the lavish food and drink around the room. She'd be a fool to do anything to jeopardize her position. Karyne was many things, and foolish was not one of them. The night began to wind down, and even though all she'd done was chat, exhaustion pressed in on her. She was debating whether or not it was too early to retire when someone cleared their throat to her right. She turned, and it was Prince Florian. It was nice to know the scholar didn't swallow Florian whole earlier, and considering the predatory gleam in the man's eyes, she wouldn't have put it past him. She curtsied. "How are you this evening, Your Highness?" I'm I'm well. And, yourself?" Florian's hands twitched at his side. "Well, indeed," Karyne said. Florian fell silent, glancing between Karyne and the dance floor, where his brother could easily be seen entertaining Lady Bianca. She waited, and still he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The wistful, envious look in his eyes said it all. Oh, did the younger prince have an attachment to the same lady his older brother was clearly courting? That wouldn't end well. "Prince Lucian is quite popular tonight," Karyne said, forcing Florian's gaze back to her with no small amount of satisfaction. "He always is." Florian smiled, and to Karen's surprise, he didn't stutter or falter in his words. "He has always been well liked by everyone he meets." "It certainly is a valuable trait to have," Karyne agreed. Florian dropped his gaze. She steeled her heart against the guilt creeping up her throat at Florian's kicked puppy disposition. She had just been trying to make conversation. It wasn't her fault he took it the wrong way. But she wasn't fast enough. "But," Karyne said, "there are other traits that are just as valuable." Florian looked up. Light flickered in his eyes, and his mouth twitched into a smile. I I imagine it would be nice to be graceful." "There are advantages to it." Karyne nodded, resting her hands together at her waist. "Have—" Florian started, glancing over the crowd and then back to her. "Have you, always loved dancing?" Huh. No one had ever asked her that before, and she hadn't really considered it. Before she acquired the shoes, she had liked dancing as much as anyone did, but not particularly more. She wouldn't have ever thought it would be how she earned her living. "It gives my life purpose," Karyne said, focusing on the truth of the matter. "Oh." Florian blinked. Uh, I I hardly see you when you're not performing. What, um, what else do you like to do?" If she'd never come across her enchanted shoes, what else would she have done? After her mother's death, she didn't have any good options other than to starve. She supposed she might have gone around town, trying to find someone who needed an apprentice, maybe someone who needed a scribe. It wouldn't have paid well, but it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world to spend the rest of her life surrounded by books, copying letter after letter. Of course, compared to being the darling of the court, it was about as appealing as working in a pig pen. "I like to read every once in a while, when I'm not practicing," Karyne said. And it was true. She did wish she had more time for it, but dancing was what kept her in the palace, not reading. Florian's face lit up, and Karyne saw why he was considered to be very handsome. "Have you been to the library yet? We have quite the collection." She was impressed he managed 2 complete sentences. Maybe it was easier for him to talk about the things he loved. "No, not yet. I have a few books from home that have kept me occupied," Karyne said. "What do you like to read? I know the library by heart. I I could make a recommendation," Florian said. His eagerness would have been contagious if Karyne hadn't walled herself off. "I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to give it the right amount of attention it would deserve," Karyne said. "I would hate to waste your time, Your Highness." "Oh." Florian's face fell, and she swore in her head as the kicked puppy expression returned. If he was doing it on purpose, he was more cunning than she gave him credit for. If he wasn't, and he really was prone to wearing his heart on his sleeve, it was working well for him. But Karen's mouth moved faster than her mind could process. "If you found me a book of poems, I could make time for something shorter, like that." "I'll do my best." Florian's demeanor changed in an instant. Light poured out of the smile he shot her before rushing away. She didn't even have the chance to curtsy before he was gone. Surely he wasn't going to look for one at that very moment. Karyne glanced back over the crowd and spotted Prince Lucian laughing with Lady Bianca and several other noble women. Maybe that was why. Yes, that made more sense. He must have been looking for any excuse to avoid seeing his brother with the woman he wanted. As she watched, Karyne was struck by a question she'd never considered before. Why did all the ladies of the court swoon over Prince Lucian's infamous smirks and grins, when Prince Florian's smile was bright enough to blind a whole room? She blinked. Whether or not his smile was lovely wasn't her concern. She stomped the thoughts and faint stirrings down. By the time she regained her composure, most of the court was retiring anyway. What a strange night. But Karyne couldn't deny the fact that it would be nice to read something new. Chapter 3. It was far past midnight, and if Karyne had to guess, dawn was likely approaching. She had brushed off her strange interaction with Prince Florian by the time she made it to her hallway, only to freeze in her tracks. The scholar and Gothel stood outside her room. "Hello there, Karyne. I don't believe we've been properly introduced," the scholar said. He gestured towards himself and the woman. "I'm the scholar, and this is Gothel." Did he expect her to recognize their names? "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, dipping into a curtsy. The scholar's eyes landed on her bright red shoes. He grinned. Her toes curled. He said, "Now, I know quality when I see it. Where did you get those?" "I bought them in the marketplace. I didn't ask the name of the merchant," Karyne said, letting her skirts hide her shoes from view. The scholar glanced around the empty hallway. "What's your price?" Karyne stepped back. "My price?" "For the shoes," Gothel spoke up, crossing her arms. "They're not for sale." "Everything is for sale, dear." The scholar spoke as though he was 20 years her elder, rather than her equal. "What's your price? And you're not limited to simply asking for money. I don't know if you've heard, but we're quite talented." Was he talking about magic? Karyne wondered. If she named some outrageous price, and they actually came through, she'd be set for life. She'd never have to dance again. But what if they didn't? What if they took the shoes and hung her out to dry? She'd lose her position in the palace, all that she'd worked for. And even if she did have the money, it wouldn't be enough. Now that she knew what it was like to be the center of attention, she couldn't go back to being no one. "Like I said, the shoes are not for sale, so I suggest you get on your way. I'm not interested in doing business with you." "I would watch your words carefully, dancer," the scholar said, taking a step closer. Darkness edged into his eyes. I am not someone you want to make an enemy of. Just because you have everyone in Castia fooled doesn't mean you can fool us. I sensed the magic pouring off those shoes all throughout your little dance the other day. I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about. Karyne took another step back. Her shoulders brushed against cold stone. I'm not leaving this castle until those shoes are in my hands. You might want to get used to being disappointed. Karyne narrowed her eyes. Read my lips. The only way you're getting these shoes is if you pry them off my cold, dead feet. Don't tempt me, dancer, the scholar rumbled. I may not be noble, but it doesn't matter how powerful you are. You won't be able to kill the court's favorite entertainment and get away with it, Karyne said, hoping it was true, without letting anything other than stone-cold defiance show. Who said I had to kill you for you to die? The scholar stepped back, raising an eyebrow. Scholar? Gothel stepped up behind him, a cautious lilt to her words. Stay out of this, the scholar threw over his shoulder. He turned back to Karyne with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Fine. You want those shoes to stay on your feet? I'll grant your wish. Karyne pressed herself into the wall. What was he going to do? Strange, incomprehensible words flew out of his mouth. She tried to duck around him, but he grabbed her arm and sent her to the ground. Her skirts tangled around her legs, and her feet burned. This is a bad idea, Gothel tried to interrupt, but the foreign words grew louder and louder. Karyne cried out as she scrambled to look at her feet. Pain tore through her ankles, drowning out all other noise. Her feet were on fire. She grabbed at the red shoes, but the heat seared her hands. She cradled her burnt hands towards her chest as tears rolled down her face. The pain grew and grew, and in that moment, if she had gotten any words out, she would have begged someone, anyone, to cut her feet off and spare her the pain. How long would this last? Karyne tried again to reach for her feet, but the burning continued on and on. Her chest heaved as she tried to get enough air past the agony ripping her apart. Real fire couldn't possibly be as painful as whatever this was. Her burnt hands scraped against the stone floor as she reached out, but nothing was there. She used her sleeve to wipe away the tears so she could see, but no one was there. The pain started to fade. She ached, but forced her burnt hands under her, pushing herself off the ground. Where had they gone? Her voice croaked as she whispered, Hello? She glanced up and down the hall, but no one was there. Had no one heard her screaming? Apparently not. Likely the scholar's doing. She fumbled with her skirts, wincing at how even the smooth fabric irritated her hands. As Karyne edged her skirts up, she braced herself for the damage. But when the silk revealed her feet, they looked no different than they had before. How was that possible? The only difference was that her shoes pressed in a little tighter, visibly pinching her skin. But no burns. Not like she'd expected. Was that it? Some intimidation tactic? Well, it wasn't going to work. Karyne grabbed onto the wall, wincing at the pangs shooting up her arms as she pulled herself to her feet. Her legs shook and her whole body ached. Fortunately, she made it the last few steps to her room and tumbled through the door. She barely managed to get it closed and locked behind her before sinking onto her bed. She pulled her skirts up and grabbed her right shoe. Her skin burned, but she tugged anyway. The red shoe did not budge an inch. Her heart turned to lead. She grabbed her left foot and tugged as hard as she could, ignoring how her hands screamed at her to stop. The bright red shoe refused to budge. The force sent Karyne back into her mattress. They weren't coming off. Why weren't they coming off? All the air shot out of her lungs. She scrambled forward, grabbing her foot and pulling again and again. But it was futile. Even if she had the strongest man in the world, he wouldn't be able to get the shoe to budge even a hair. That must have been what the scholar had done. She'd never be able to take them off. She took deep breaths, fighting the panic crawling up her throat. He was trying to break her, trying to make her want to get rid of the shoes. Well, she might not be a witch or wizard, but she could be just as clever. She wasn't going to give him what he wanted. If that meant she had to wear the shoes every day for the rest of her life, fine. That's exactly what she would do. Besides, red was her color. Chapter 4. When Karyne saw the scholar the next night, sitting in the balcony beside the princes, she kept her expression cold and neutral. Instead, she focused on her performance. Fortunately, she was only doing one dance before the musicians took over the entertainment completely. That was for the best. Karyne couldn't stand being in the same room as that smarmy wizard. Her muscles ached distantly, but not enough to slow her performance. She didn't even have to think about her movements. All she had to do was trust her shoes. Applause washed over her, and she couldn't help the smug grin creeping across her face. If the scholar thought she was going to be easy to break, he was very wrong. When she slipped out into the halls, she let her shoulders relax. She rolled her neck as her shoes clicked on the floor. How she was going to take a warm bath with these cursed shoes stuck on her feet, she hadn't figured out yet, but she would. She hadn't gotten far when footsteps followed her. Her heart stuttered, and all the color drained out of her. Panic tore through her, and she looked over her shoulder with her hands sinking into her skirts, ready to run. But it was only Prince Florian. Are you all right? Florian glanced around, but they were the only two in the ornate hallway. Karyne took a deep breath and put on a cool, collected expression. I'm fine. Just startled, Your Highness. I thought I was alone. That's all. I'm sorry, Florian said, lowering his gaze to the book in his hands. The instinct to reassure him, to tell him it was the scholar she feared, was overwhelming. She had stepped forward, the words ready to leave her mouth, when she forced her jaw closed. It would be insanity to tell anyone what happened. Just as the scholar couldn't outright kill her and get away with it, she couldn't accuse a powerful foreign visitor of attacking her with no proof. And if she so much as showed even a hint of weakness, she was certain the scholar would be all over her again. It's not your fault, Your Highness. Is there something I can do for you? Karyne willed her heart to slow. Florian looked up and held out the book he'd been carrying. But before she could ask, his gaze locked onto her hands. She closed her palms and buried them in her skirts again, ignoring the stinging pain shooting up them. What happened to your hands? Florian's eyes widened as alarm filled his voice. A small accident with my fireplace, Karyne said, pressing her palms against the smooth fabric. It's summer. He blinked at her with a frown. That's why it was an accident. Karyne gave him a charming grin. She needed to redirect the conversation. What is it that you have there, Your Highness? Florian looked back at the book in his hands, holding it out again. It's a collection from the best Castian poets. Karyne snatched the book out of his hands, keeping him from looking at her palms too long. You work fast, Your Highness. Florian shrugged. It didn't take me long to find it. I, uh, I hope you enjoy it. And maybe, when you finish, you could tell me what you think? I'm afraid that while I enjoy reading very much, I'm not well versed in fine literature and analysis. Karyne tightened her grip on the hard cover. Her hands burned, but she turned the pain into a smile. Oh, you don't have to if you don't want to. I just thought, Florian said, glancing over his shoulder. Never mind. I hope you enjoy them. Florian turned on his heel and disappeared before Karyne could even process what just happened. That was 3 times over the last few days that Prince Florian had approached her, and each time he barely managed to string 2 sentences together. What did he want? She tried to think over what she knew about him, and it wasn't much. She almost never saw him interact with anyone, the only exception being his brother. While Lucien was popular and had a large group of friends made up of the young men and the young women at court, she never saw Florian interact with them. He stood on the sides of the room and watched most of the time. Maybe that was what it was about. Since she wasn't part of the court, she was a safe person to practice befriending, and goodness knows he needed it. If he was ever going to befriend anyone or even think of courting a lady, he needed to get comfortable around people. A lady. The wistful look in his eye when he watched his brother and Lady Bianca. That had to be it. While Karyne didn't begrudge him the clever strategy, she didn't have time for it, not with a cursed pair of shoes and a wizard breathing down her neck. The king and queen weren't paying her to babysit the prince and teach him social skills. They were paying her to dance. That was where her focus needed to be. But she held the book of poems a little closer. It'd be nice to sit down and read a little. Karyne had been sleeping as well as she could with a pair of shoes stuck to her feet, when a strange, awful sound forced her awake. It was as though someone purposefully tuned their instrument, so every note was a variation of nails scratching and shrieking against various surfaces. She tried to pull her pillow over her ears to block it out, but the sound didn't muffle at all. Her feet moved of their own accord, and as Karyne blearily opened her eyes, her hands fumbled with the door. She was out in the hallway, prancing down it before she was even fully awake. As the fog around her mind cleared, she stumbled into the small ballroom near her wing. The awful music continued, but there was no one playing. What was happening? Why wasn't she in control of her own body? She reached the center of the floor, and the notes picked up. She winced, but her feet and arms moved regardless. Then she was dancing, an awful, disjointed routine, but she had no other word for it. Magic. It had to be magic. As Karyne continued to move against her will, she knew the scholar hadn't just made it so she couldn't remove the shoes. That was only part of it. Whatever this awful dance was had to be the heart of it. Dread and panic made their way to her heart. Was she going to dance herself to death? No. At least, Karyne didn't think that was what this was about. If that was the case, Why hadn't she started dancing the second the scholar put this curse on her? She caught glimpses of the dark night sky and the moon shimmering in it through the windows. It was midnight. If this dance started at midnight, maybe that meant it would end when dawn appeared. It had to end, right? Karyne clung to that thought as she continued moving. The music continued to screech. She wished it wasn't just in her head, so she wasn't the only one subjected to it. But even if it was audible, the whole palace was asleep. She was alone. Time ticked by, and she danced and danced. A faint ache set into her muscles, and she yawned often. This couldn't last forever. It had to stop sometime. Her feet traced the patterns engraved in the light marble floor. The painted ceiling and unlit chandeliers tormented her from their heights. She spun and spun, her stomach pitching with every breath. The room was much colder without the candlelight and devoid of people. Only a night before, the room had been filled with light and laughter. Karyne could see the people in her head, all of them above her, all of them worth more than her, no matter how hard she tried. She moved and moved, the smallest of creatures dwarfed by the weight of the emptiness. Despite all the nice clothes and distant adoration, she was as alone as the day her mother died. A door creaked, and Karyne spun on her toes. If it was the scholar, she was going to strangle him with her bare hands, foreign politics aside. Well, if her hands let her. Prince Florian stood in the doorway, staring at her. Karyne? Twice in one night. She managed to wrangle her hands into the skirt of her nightgown and curtsied. She was too exhausted to be embarrassed at being seen in her nightclothes. They were modest, and the prince himself was dressed down in a simple loose shirt and pants. The look suited him better than the more expensive garments she usually saw him in. Your Highness, Karyne managed to say, before the music in her head insisted she start moving again. She saw Florian in the corner of her eye as he moved into the room. His eyes never left her as she danced. What are you doing? How could she possibly explain? She didn't even fully understand what was going on. Besides, if she told him, he'd probably want to do something about it. No. If anyone came too close, if they discovered the truth, her life was over. She couldn't involve anyone else. Best to make him think it was perfectly normal. I'm rehearsing. Karyne hoped her curt dismissal was strong enough to send him scurrying away. In the middle of the night? Florian came closer. With no music? What can I say, Your Highness? Inspiration strikes at the strangest times. The shrieking notes continued tearing through her head. She kept dancing, but was able to slow her movements, allowing her to catch her breath slightly. May I ask what you're doing up in the middle of the night? I couldn't sleep. Figured I'd take a walk. I heard your footsteps and... Florian came to a stop, hovering just outside the circle she'd been moving in. I had a lot on my mind. Karyne glanced at the windows. Light had started to break the horizon. Her movements continued to slow. Was this it? Was it over? The music faded, and her feet stilled. She came to a stop in front of Florian. Exhaustion seeped into her bones. She needed to end the conversation. Well, I hope you were able to clear your mind, Your Highness. He shook his head. I'm afraid not. Fine. He went out of his way to give her a book, The least she could do was ask, "Do you want to talk about it?" He took a deep breath and stared at the floor. I. There's, there's this girl. She's amazing, and um, she won't look twice at me. I've tried, but I don't know what to do." Oh. Karyne thought back and remembered the way he'd looked at Lady Bianca. That was messy. "Chin up, Your Highness," Karyne said. As he looked up, she crossed her arms. "You're a prince. There's plenty of ladies in the court who are lovely enough and would be perfectly happy to be with you. Don't bother with someone who doesn't see your value. You can have anyone." "I don't want just anyone. I want her," Florian said, and there was passion in his voice. Huh. She hadn't realized he was capable of it. "May I be frank, Your Highness?" Karyne asked, wiping the sweat off her brow. He nodded, fear entering his eyes. "If you want her to notice you, you need to make an effort. Of course, she won't notice if you don't talk to her or do anything with her. Practicing on me is fine, but at some point, you'll need to actually approach her." "Practicing?" Florian blanched, and his eyes widened. "Right, Lucien said something similar." "You should take his advice. I'm certainly not the best person to go to about this kind of matter," Karyne said. What do you mean, this kind of matter?" Florian laced his fingers together. "Romantic matters. I have no experience in them, nor do I want to learn." Karyne lifted her chin. She didn't need any complications in her life. Even if she could trust someone with her secret, it wouldn't be enough. While she loved being adored, she'd much rather be adored by a crowd than one man alone. One person's love would never satisfy her burning need to be seen, to be adored. Other people could settle. She was above such things. Florian nodded and glanced at the doors. I should go." She dipped into a curtsy as he hurried away. Once he was gone, she dragged herself back to her room and sunk into her bed. What an awful night. And she had the terrible feeling this was not a one-time occurrence. I hope you enjoyed listening to Shoes of Red, Part 1 by Celeste Baxendell, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Celeste, go to celestebaxendell.com to find more of her books. While you're there, you can snag Trials of Feathers and Faith, a free prequel to her latest series. Have you subscribed to Finding Fantasy Reads? If not, I highly recommend it. It should be available on your preferred podcasting platform, and it lets you automatically download new episodes as they come in. I personally use Overcast, but there are pros and cons to all the options out there. Subscribing also helps increase the podcast's visibility on podcast platforms, which helps both authors and listeners find the show, which will allow me to keep making more episodes. And you want that, right? I'll have links for all the platforms as well as Celeste's website in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.